Hotel quarantine procedures were under the microscope in Brisbane today after it was revealed 2 returned travellers were allowed to leave their hotel prematurely. Meanwhile, in Victoria, the government is under pressure for allowing COVID-positive tennis players into the state, while still preventing Victorian holidaymakers, many trapped in New South Wales, from coming across their own border and going home. Our Canberra reporter Trudy McIntosh is across all the detail. I caught up with her a little earlier. Trudy, a lot of heat going on in Brisbane today over the suspicion that the virus has somehow escaped hotel quarantine. Tell us about how they defended that today.
Well, the Queensland authorities are saying that this has been a normal practice, that there wasn't in fact a breach of quarantine. It centres around reports yesterday that a couple were able to leave hotel quarantine. The report was they did so in a taxi or an Uber and go to hospital. The day after, they then tested positive to this UK strain of the virus. Authorities today saying they were transferred, in fact, in an ambulance, in full personal protective equipment. The reason both of them went there, they'd come from Lebanon, and the father can't speak English very well, so his daughter was allowed to come with him. Authorities saying that this is normal procedure, that it happens all the time, that people move from hotel quarantine to hospital and then come back. But given the lockdown that Brisbane went into, you can understand the fears that there would be about this UK strain getting out of hotel quarantine once again.
Yeah, probably the first example of a little bit of compassion, so we can't be that critical of them. Now, Annastacia Palaszczuk's thought bubble about shifting hotel quarantine to the middle of Queensland to these mining camps is very quickly unravelling.
Well, she was at pains to point out today, Chris, that it's a proposal, that she wasn't making a formal decision on this, that they're going to see all the options, take it to National Cabinet this time next week. But that's in part because there's been significant pushback from federal authorities that moving to the regions isn't a bright idea, that they've looked at this in the past and it actually can potentially pose a bigger risk. It's the same thought from epidemiologists as well, but also pushback from areas that are being touted as potential options. Today I've spoken to people in Gladstone. The real concern there, a potential of using a mining accommodation which is outside the town as one of these quarantine hubs, but that they just don't have the logistical infrastructure to actually cope with any positive cases they would get. There's no ICU facility in Gladstone, for example, so that would make things very difficult if someone were to test positive and need to go on a ventilator. Here was the State Labor MP on those medical concerns.
How it's managed and what it looks like and how the medical treatment goes all plays a big part of it. The health facilities here in Gladstone aren't to what we see in Rockhampton, aren't what we see in Bundaberg or in Toowoomba or even in Brisbane. The camp out at Calliope has been mooted for the NRL bubble. It didn't happen. We've had a look at it last year for this same thing and it didn't happen.
And finally, Trudy, it's really heating up in Victoria as we hear that some of these tennis players will be infected, like COVID positive, when they arrive for the Australian Open. And then you've got Daniel Andrews calling for international students to save the tertiary industry as well. But all this time, there are Victorian holidaymakers in Queensland and New South Wales who can't go home.
Yeah, Victorians, some of them saying that this is hypocrisy from the government, that they're trying to let in people who make money for the state when Victorians who just want to come home can't actually return. In terms of those international students, it's not just Victorian government who's been facing the heat. The university sector would like to see some sort of national way to quarantine international students, given how lucrative that is for them as a university sector. They've tried to look at this before in terms of pilot programs, people doing quarantine on campuses, but it was decided that it was too big of a risk. But the government today saying they need to make sure this is safe, that they will be raising it with their federal authorities. But at the very same time, you're seeing plane loads of tennis stars fly into Melbourne and Victorians stranded interstate. You can see why the optics of this one are a little tricky for the government down there.
And finally, one of the most serious topics of the day is Joe the pigeon, Trudy. This is the pigeon that went from Alabama all the way to a backyard in Melbourne. And I understand that quarantine officials have stuck their noses in. They want to euthanise Joe the pigeon. And a few people have had something to say about that.
Well, Joe the pigeon is now essentially on death row. That's the warning from the Victorian government. The acting Prime Minister today saying he hadn't heard of the case, but he then went on with a very stern warning that if he didn't fly home, that he essentially needed to be euthanised. It reminded some of what Barnaby Joyce had done when he issued that very stern warning back in the day to one of those movie stars about pistol and boo those dogs if they didn't comply with our quarantine, that they would be sent back home. It's one of those issues as acting PM. You've got to be across all the issues, great and small.
Because I'm not aware of Joe's plight or flight or future. Happy to look into it and get back to you. Good luck, Joe. But if Joe has come in a way that has not met our strict biosecurity measures, then bad luck, Joe. Either fly home or face the consequences.
He should read the papers a little bit more, the acting Prime Minister.